It's the simple thing for Mark Carney to do is get out of the way. Get out of the way.
The cameras flashed, microphones crowded the podium, and Pierre Poilievre stepped up with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what message he wanted to send. This wasn't Parliament. This wasn't question period. This was a press conference, and Poilievre knew that every word spoken here would ripple far beyond the room. He began by making his support crystal clear. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's new pipeline proposal wasn't just another policy idea, it was, in his words, a litmus test for the federal government. A pass-or-fail moment that would reveal whether Ottawa was serious about energy infrastructure, or whether it planned to keep blocking the West at every turn. And from the moment he said it, the narrative was set. Poilievre didn't just talk about oil and steel. He framed the issue as one of trust and accountability. If the federal government can't even get behind this project, what does that say about its priorities? His tone was sharp, almost challenging, daring Ottawa to prove it was more than empty promises. He pointed to the surprising fact that Alberta and the federal government are already 80% aligned on the pipeline's terms. That's rare in Canadian politics. 80% agreement should mean the hard part is already done. But as Poilievre reminded the reporters in the room, it's the remaining 20% that could kill the entire deal. And that 20% is loaded with demands, emissions caps, carbon capture commitments, and environmental strings that Alberta may be forced to swallow. The message was clear: Ottawa is playing gatekeeper. And then came the pivot. Poilievre stressed that Alberta isn't trying to build the pipeline itself. Smith's government isn't looking to gamble taxpayer dollars on megaprojects. Instead, the private sector, companies like Enbridge or Trans Mountain, is ready to step in. They have the money, the expertise, and the appetite. All they need is a green light. That point hit home. To supporters it sounded like common sense: let private industry take the risk, let workers reap the rewards, and let Canada finally get a project off the ground without drowning it in red tape. But the press knew the counterarguments, and so did Poilievre. Because no pipeline in Canada is ever simple. He acknowledged the biggest obstacle: British Columbia. Premier David Eby has made it clear he opposes lifting the tanker ban on the northwest coast. That means even if Alberta builds the pipeline, the oil may never make it to international markets. For opponents, this is the fatal flaw, proof that the plan is doomed before it even begins. A pipeline to nowhere, they sneer. Poilievre's response was blunt. To him, the tanker ban isn't about environmental safety, it's about political obstruction. He painted it as yet another example of how Ottawa and its allies block economic opportunity under the guise of climate responsibility. He argued that Canada cannot call itself an energy nation while cutting off its own access to global markets.
Before moving forward, hit subscribe button, because this story is only getting started.
The room stirred as he went on. Poilievre accused the federal government of hypocrisy, boasting about energy security abroad while crippling it at home. He reminded Canadians that while our resources sit idle, foreign competitors are seizing markets and pocketing billions. His words were sharp, but his delivery was calculated. This wasn't just a policy pitch, it was a performance designed to show strength, clarity, and leadership. And the media knew it. Every soundbite from that podium was crafted to travel. Supporters would see a leader standing up for workers and provinces tired of being ignored. Opponents would see a politician doubling down on oil at a time when the world is turning to renewables. Either way, no one could ignore the contrast he was drawing: Ottawa dithers, Alberta builds. Ottawa hesitates, Poilievre acts. The press conference had all the makings of political theater, but it was theater with stakes. For Danielle Smith, it was validation. For Alberta, it was hope. For the federal government, it was pressure. And for Pierre Poilievre, it was an opportunity to cast himself as the only leader willing to take that 20% gap and turn it into 100. Outside the press room, reaction was already spilling over. Supporters celebrated on social media, calling the pipeline proposal a lifeline for Canada's economy. Critics, on the other hand, accused Poilievre of playing directly into the hands of oil lobbyists, branding him reckless and short-sighted. The country, once again, was split down the middle. But that was exactly the kind of division Poilievre thrived on. He knew this wasn't just about one project. It was about identity, prosperity, and the vision of Canada's future. And with every sentence, he made it clear, he intended to lead that future. The press conference was over in minutes, but the aftershocks would last for weeks. Because this wasn't just about a pipeline. It was about whether Canada still had the courage to build.
I'm responding today to the news that Premier Danielle Smith has been forced to set up a government corporation to build a pipeline because Mark Carney and the Liberals have scared away all of the private businesses that normally build pipelines with their own money. While Canadian pipeline company Enbridge builds 2 pipelines in the United States of America, and TransCanada Pipelines is investing $8.5 billion building projects, again in the United States of America. And Imperial Oil shuts down its Calgary office, killing 900 jobs. No major private company is willing to build pipelines to ship oil under this Liberal government in Canada. I'm responding today to
The echoes of Poilievre's press conference hadn't even faded before the political machine went into overdrive. Within hours, the clips were everywhere, replayed on news channels, dissected on talk radio, clipped into fiery TikToks and YouTube shorts. What Poilievre had done was simple. He'd drawn a line in the sand, and now every political player in Canada was being forced to pick a side. On one hand, Danielle Smith was celebrating a major win. For months, she'd been hammering home Alberta's need for a new pipeline, but the national spotlight had always been elusive. Now, thanks to Poilievre, the issue wasn't just provincial. It was front page coast to coast. Smith seized the moment, calling Poilievre's words a breakthrough and a validation of Alberta's vision. Behind the scenes, her team knew this was more than validation. It was momentum, but momentum in Canadian politics is never uncontested. From Ottawa, the response came quickly. Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't mention Poilievre by name at first, but his tone said everything. He praised the spirit of dialogue between Alberta and the federal government while warning against reckless rhetoric that oversimplifies complex environmental obligations. In other words, Carney wasn't backing down. He was signaling that if Alberta wanted a deal, it would be on federal terms. And those terms were already being sharpened. Emissions targets, carbon capture, methane reductions. Ottawa was preparing to load the proposal with conditions heavy enough to satisfy international climate commitments. For Carney, it was about credibility on the world stage. For Poilievre, it was a political trap disguised as environmental policy. The clash was set. Meanwhile, industry leaders watched with cautious optimism. Executives from major pipeline companies hinted that they were ready to act, but behind closed doors they worried about delays, lawsuits, and regulatory hurdles. They had seen too many projects die slow deaths in courtrooms and review boards. Poilievre's firebrand support was energizing, but investors knew better than to celebrate too early. And then came British Columbia. Premier David Eby doubled down within a day, reaffirming his opposition to lifting the tanker ban. His statement was blunt. No project will put our coast at risk. To environmental groups, this was music to their ears. To Alberta, it was infuriating. And to Poilievre, it was proof of the wall he'd been warning about. In commentary across the country, the question became unavoidable. What good is a pipeline if there's no access to export markets? Alberta could pump oil across prairies and mountains, but without BC's cooperation, the dream of shipping barrels overseas looked like fantasy. Critics pounced. They called the project a dead end, a distraction designed to score political points rather than deliver real results. Editorials accused Poilievre of using Alberta's frustrations as campaign fuel, while knowing the project was unlikely to survive. But here's where things got interesting. The criticism didn't slow him down, it amplified him. Poilievre leaned into the attacks, framing himself as the only leader willing to say what others wouldn't. In speeches that followed, he accused the federal government and BC's leadership of treating Alberta like a colony, happy to take its money, but never willing to let it grow. That rhetoric struck a nerve, especially in the West. Social media lit up with hashtags like #BuildItNow and #EnergyFreedom, as Albertans vented their frustration at decades of stalled projects. Meanwhile, environmental groups mobilized with equal passion. They organized press calls, staged demonstrations, and blasted Poilievre as a politician dragging Canada backward. For them, the tanker ban wasn't just policy, it was protection against the next inevitable oil spill. Their messaging was emotional, powerful, and tailor-made for headlines. The country was split into two competing visions of Canada. On one side, a Canada that builds pipelines, creates jobs, and pushes its resources into global markets. On the other, a Canada that doubles down on climate leadership, sacrificing old industries to lead in renewables. And standing between them, Mark Carney, juggling the impossible task of pleasing both. Inside Ottawa, whispers began to surface. Some Liberal strategists worried that Poilievre had successfully framed the debate in his terms. Instead of talking about jobs and the environment, Canadians were suddenly talking about jobs versus the environment. That binary played directly into Poilievre's hands, fueling his image as a fighter willing to stand up to elites. Others argue the opposite, that Carney had the upper hand. With BC on his side and environmental groups rallying behind him, he could afford to stand firm. In their view, Poilievre was overreaching, risking credibility by backing a proposal already facing logistical nightmares. But one thing was clear, the press conference had changed the game. What began as a single provincial pitch had become a national showdown, one with implications far beyond Alberta. Investors were watching, voters were watching, and the world was watching to see whether Canada would finally deliver a project of scale or retreat once more into paralysis. The stakes had grown larger than a pipeline. They had become a test of leadership itself. And as the days ticked on, the pressure built like steam in a locked chamber, waiting for the inevitable explosion.
After a decade of Liberals and under the weak, incompetent leadership of Mark Carney, business is losing money and taxpayers have to bail them out. It's the simple thing for Mark Carney to do is get out of the way. Get out of the way. That is literally the only thing Mark Carney needs to do to get pipelines built in Canada. I'm going to say that one more time because we have massively overcomplicated this. Mark Carney needs to do one thing for pipelines to get built. Get out of the way.
The debate over Danielle Smith's pipeline proposal had grown far beyond its technical details. It was no longer about routes, permits, or tanker bans. It had become a symbol, a battle line for the kind of country Canada was going to be. On one side stood Pierre Poilievre, hammering home his message with relentless clarity. For him, this pipeline was about respect for Alberta, about jobs for Canadians, and about breaking free from the cycle of hesitation that had defined Ottawa for decades. Every time he spoke, he reminded voters that leadership meant choosing to build, not choosing to stall. On the other side was Prime Minister Mark Carney, balancing international climate commitments with the political weight of provinces pulling in different directions. His government's conditions kept the door open, but only barely. To Carney, the pipeline was a test of responsibility. To Poilievre, it was a test of courage. And caught between them were Canadians, frustrated, divided, hopeful, and uncertain. Some saw a lifeline, others saw a dangerous gamble. Everyone, however, knew this was no longer just about Alberta. It was about Canada's future role in the world, and whether this country could still build big projects in an era defined by gridlock. As the cameras turned off and the speeches ended, one truth became impossible to ignore: this fight was far from finished. The pipeline might rise, or it might collapse under political weight. But the lines had been drawn. Poilievre had set the stage. Carney had answered. Smith had pushed her vision. Eby had drawn his boundary. And Canadians now had a front-row seat to a showdown that would define not only energy policy, but leadership itself. The story of this pipeline wasn't ending. It was only beginning.
Canada debates.